time for a PEP Talk video 2. Now the aims and objectives of this video is where we're going to be looking into the behavioural science, where opportunity, capability and motive come into play. We're going to be then looking at PEP risk exposures, the 4 levels of classifying a PEP risk. We will then look at the EDD process, the enhanced due diligence process, and what does it mean to exercise reasonable judgment. We then shall be looking into special procedures. What does it mean by the term special procedure? Followed by summary. Now, this is not an exhaustive list or topic on PEP KYC. As the subject matter is forever evolving, if I was to provide you all that I know and what I have picked up, then we'd be here for hours. And the aim of this video is to provide you with some insight or foundational insight into PEPS, albeit the basics for your understanding and for you to carry out your due diligence role better. Now, let's go on to behavioural science. PEPs are first and foremost human beings. They are, as any human being is, susceptible to a number of things that influence them. Their memories, their experiences changes, their values and their beliefs. An experience can trigger a change in their value and therefore have a direct result on their belief system. This could then cause a whirlwind of changes within their motivations that justify their actions to commit money laundering or terrorist financing. The reason why they're able to commit this is because, firstly, they're in a position of trust. They have the opportunity, they have the capability and the motive to carry out corruption. These 3 things are what profile a fraudster. Now, as you can see above, following a 2007 to 2011 study by KPMG and a 1996 to date study by the Association of Fraud Examiners. Such offenders usually have no prior criminal background. They have no untoward employment background. They are usually, as you say, in a position of trust, clean employment record, no criminal background, and they are usually medial to senior management and have been in the organisation they work for over 15 years. It's a psychological change, what I like to call the stressor. This causes the motive to change. This is one of the reasons why PEPs are monitored almost scrutinisingly close, because of the changes within political external environment. For example, work, news, area residency, etc. And also the internal environment, personal life, home, family, etc. These things can have a direct impact on the psyche of any individual, let alone the individual is having their strings pulled by or influenced by one personality or another. And you have to understand the PEP networks and keep redefining his or her connections on an ongoing basis, because anything, as we know throughout life, can happen at any time, and therefore we do not know what motivations, opportunity or capability would occur in each circumstance. Now, the above 3 opportunities can be available to any power-hungry PEP, or even their close family members, often on a power trip of their PEP connection. Now, this can also include, in some cultures, their grandparents and external family members too, because they all get treated like royalty. Any close associate or family member or the PEP themselves can be a sleeper cell, working under the guise of close associate or close family member, but their actual objective is to carry out terrorist financing through a number of accounts and what have you, or using the PEP association status. And this is why we look into different areas or surrounding the PEP, close family members and close associates. So you can appreciate how banks or other financial institutions, and of course non-financial institutions, are playing a balancing act with their risk appetite on building relationships with PEPs. and the exposure of risk associated with such relationship, as well as working closely with transaction monitoring to mitigate or minimize such risks. Now let's look at the ongoing due diligence and onboarding. What I explained in the previous slide is why onboarding, due diligence and ongoing transaction monitoring is very, very important. It all revolves around KYC. For example, who is my client? So who is your client? And how do you know the risk associated with that client? To answer this question, your organization's policy actually comes into place or comes into focus. And note that these policies are always changing and evolving, because not only would you look at, and forgive me if I'm being too simplistic here, you look at jurisdictional risk, you're looking into the risk of countries' corruption level 2, the political issues currently surrounding these countries, and the level of sanctions in place in these areas. Remember, in many cases, sanctions is the last step before war. So you have to really try and understand or comprehend why such a person would like to start a business relationship and why at that particular moment in time. That's very important. Due to the evolution of the PEP risk exposure, KYC is no longer a tick box exercise. You have to really get into the mind of the client and try to understand their motive for the business relationship. For example, why now? As this stretches further than what used to be so-called KYC action. And this is why I like to use classical conditioning and rename it as UYC. Understand your customer. I've realized or tested this theory out, and once I rename the action, I notice everyone seems to approach the subject matter differently. They become less familiar with the KYC habits and more diligent in the onboarding and monitoring tasks. Areas of psychology does play a big part if we are to manage our team effectively and efficiently. Let's look onto PEP risk exposure and the 4 levels of classifying a PEP. Corrupt PEPs have been known to utilize banks as a medium for illegal activities. That is no secret. They've ranged from corruption and bribery to money laundering through to terrorist financing. Different types of PEPs pose different levels of risks. These levels of risks differ depending on many factors, according to the BSA or Bank Secrecy Act, including the geographic location, the industry or sector position, and level or nature of influence or authority, the purpose of the account, the actual or anticipated activity, the products and services used, and finally, the size or complexity of the account relationship. Now, as a result of the above, some PEPs risk level is low and some high. A bank's reputation is at risk if they conduct business with a PEP that is known to be dishonest or crooked. It is therefore helpful for banks to be aware of who the PEP is in terms of their access, control, influence over the government and or corporate accounts. This is why we have PEP risk exposures. Let's look at it in another way. So PEP risk exposure is best managed by adopting a risk-based policy. This has to be in line with the best practices that tackle key issues, being, for example, going back to my original questions, who is a PEP? How do we identify a PEP? When do we check? How do we check? How do we address this source of wealth issue? Now, understanding and balancing these concepts on PEPs is an ongoing issue for most institutions, if not all. The firm's policies are forever changing and evolving. So on one hand you have sanctions issues that go on. The other hand you have corruption level of the country, jurisdictional risk. Then you have their footprints, where their footprints are going. Then you have the residential jurisdiction. Then you have their corporate structure. How do we look at the corporate structure? And it's almost like you are, methodologically speaking, at times being held up by a load of guns pointing at you, and then uncertain which one or if any is due to go off. Bottom line, stay updated on all AML and sanctions issues. That's the only way we can keep abreast. So let's look at the FATF definition of PEPS again quickly. This definition requires additional anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures for business relationships with PEPs. Such requirements are preventative measures rather than suspicion of criminal activity. As I mentioned previously, majority of the PEPs are working with integrity, but due to their accessibility, they can easily carry out money laundering or terrorist financing. Again, it's a preventative measure rather than a suspicion of criminal activity. Please keep this in mind. So, PEP classifications to measure risk. There's 4 such classifications here. These impact the frequency and depth of your enhanced due diligence reviews. Level 1 is high risks on PEPs, naturally. Level 2 is medium to high risks. Level 3 is a medium risk. And level 4 is the low risks. Now, as a baseline, I'm going to go into each level and give you a quick review of what the Bank Secrecy Act suggests. Now, level 1 would be heads of state and government, members of government, national and regional, members of parliaments, national and regional, heads of military, judiciary, law enforcement and board of central banks, top ranking officials. You can see from this how this formulates a higher risk level, because these personalities would be highly exposed to political figures. Let's look at the medium to high risk levels. These are senior officials of military, judiciary and law enforcement agencies, senior officials of other state agencies and bodies and high ranking civil servants, senior members of religious groups, ambassadors and consuls, high commissioners. Let's look at level 3. Now these are simply senior management and board of directors of state-owned businesses and organisations, i.e. chairman of a bank. Now finally, level 4 would be mayors and members of local county, city and district assemblies, senior officials and functionaries of international or supranational organisations. In a nutshell, this is the 4 levels of PEP risks or categorisations. Now this information is a good way to use as an operational risk model on risk classification of PEPs. According to political transparency and jurisdictional advances, the PEPs may change from one classification to another. So it is a good way to manage the PEPs, and I would appreciate some feedback on anyone who has come across an even better way to manage PEP risks. I do not propose to have all the answers. I am constantly learning myself, as we all are, on this phenomenon or evolving phenomenon called PEP risk classification. Now let's look into reasonable judgment of PEP enhanced due diligence processes. Now, have you had someone come up to you, say, use reasonable judgment, and they're running off into the sunset, leaving you wondering? The picture I depict is usually one of Jack Nicholson's. When I go to a due diligence officer or someone management and I say, yes, use reasonable judgment, they often look at me like that. I then have to go into detail of what reasonable judgment actually means. According to the Bank Secrecy Act, AML Examination Manual, banks are to exercise reasonable judgment in designing and implementing policies, procedures and processes regarding PEPs. And by obtaining risk-based due diligence information on PEPs and to establish policies, procedures and processes with the right level of scrutiny and monitoring. KYC at the start of a business relationship is the best opportunity to gather the following information for all clients, including PEPs. So when you go into an onboarding process, you first ID the account holder and beneficial owner, including the nominal and beneficial owners of companies, trusts, partnerships, private investment companies, and or other legal entities that are account holders. You then seek information directly from the account holder and beneficial owner regarding possible PEP status. You then identify the account holders and beneficial owners' countries of residence and the level of risk for corruption and money laundering associated with these jurisdictions. I mean, Transparency International is a really good way of looking into these things. You then obtain information regarding employment, including industry and sector, and the level of risk or corruption associated with the industries and sectors. You then check references as appropriate to determine whether the account holder and or beneficial owner is or has been a PEP. Then you identify the account holder or beneficial owner's source of wealth and funds. You then obtain information on immediate family members or close associates either having transaction authority over the account or benefiting from transactions conducting through the account. You determine the purpose of the account and the expected volume and nature of account activity. You make reasonable efforts to review public sources of information. These sources will vary depending on each situation. However, banks should check the account holder and any beneficial owners of legal entities against reasonably accessible public sources of information. For example, government databases, major news publications, commercial databases, and other databases available. It's known as the reasonable judgment test. If you were approached by a regulator, police, or Interpol and asked how you justified opening an account for this person, would you be able to justify it in court? It's a really good way to measure whether you're carrying out your appropriate reasonable judgment test appropriately. Okay, let's look into special procedures. There are, of course, special procedures in place when such information cannot be obtained. These include refusing to open an account, suspend transaction activity or freezing the account, file a SAR. Remember, the FinCEN requirement is putting foreign corruption in the narrative on PEPS. Or, of course, you can close the account. What is expected from you and your firm? Now, what you have to do is make available copies of policies, procedures, and processes known as PPPs, specific to politically exposed persons. Policies should include the bank's definition of a PEP, because every bank has a different definition of a PEP, as well as procedures for opening PEP accounts and senior management's role in the approval process for opening PEP accounts. You then provide a list of accounts in the name of or on for the benefit of a PEP. The list should include the country of residence of the PEP, the account balances, and the average number and dollar volume of the transactions per month. That's that. You should provide a list of information systems or other methods used to identify the PEP accounts. What method of investigation did you go through to identify this as a PEP? And you must note that, document all that down. And finally, you must make available management reports used to monitor PEP accounts, including reports for identifying unusual and suspicious activity. Now, I can't stress enough that everything you document, everything you carry out, and everything you use to classify a PEP and a PEP on an ongoing basis of monitoring, you are actually documenting everything down, and that documentation can be used as evidence in court. So it's not a small thing. This is a huge thing. And you have to make sure you're diligent, you are aware of what's going on, and you have justified it. And most importantly, you have passed it by your supervisor or senior management to confirm these are the correct steps. Because the last thing you want is one of those guns going off and you haven't cleared it with anybody else.